Okay, here's what we know. On January 25th, College Board announced plans to take their test digital. The timeline for the launch is as follows. March 2023, they'll go, the first digital test will be introduced internationally. In fall of 2023, the digital PSAT, NMSQT, and the PSAT 8 and 9 will be given. So that's in the US. In 2024, the PSAT 10 will be given. And in March 2024, the SAT digital in the US will happen. So that timeline, I think, is important to consider, particularly the fall 2023 digital PSAT NMSQT. So that's really when that lead up to that PSAT will be important in terms of business trends. The test will be shorter because it's computer adaptive. And what computer adaptive means is that, not every student will be taking the same test. They will receive questions and difficulty level will be matched based on their answers to previous questions. So if you take a test and you're taking a computer adaptive test and you get a very difficult question wrong, the test will give you a slightly less difficult question. And if you get that wrong, another slightly less difficult question until you get it right. And that will give you about that same level again. And what it does is it just tries to establish a zone of competency. And that's how it works. And that's why this test will be much shorter. We're told it will still measure college readiness, and students will be taking the test at school or at a testing center in a proctored environment. Importantly, and this is all through the SATs or the College Board's material, is this will help them qualify for a host of scholarship programs, which certainly it still does now. PSAT, NMSQT, and SAT still qualify students for billions in merit-based aid from many scholarship programs. And I think this is going to be a major selling point that College Board will get behind. Calculators will now be allowed on all of the math section, and free practice material, as you might expect, will be made available through College Board and Khan Academy. As far as access, this was I think probably the reason that they didn't go digital sooner. They have stated that students can use their own device, like their own laptop, I'm imagining, a school computer, or the College Board will provide a computer, or will provide the, access to a computer for testing. I don't know if like testing sites are going to start popping up, or if College Board will piggyback with ETS testing centers where GREs and GMAT or GREs are conducted, at least. So that's what we know. All right. Anyone have any comments or any comments, questions, or corrections? Neil, what do you want to say about section level adaptive?
Oh, yeah. So I've been sort of digging around, and I believe that it is section level adaptive, not question level adaptive. So that meaning the GMAT is question level adaptive. You take a question, you get it right, you get a harder one, you get it wrong, you get an easier one. The GRE is section level adaptive. You get a chunk of verbal questions and you can jump around within that chunk and do whatever you want. And then depending on how you do overall on that chunk, your next chunk is either harder or easier. And then when they convert from raw score to scale score, they take into account the difficulty level of the questions that you've successfully answered. So that's it's a much different model, and allows for some jumping around, its ability to go back to questions, for example. And that is my understanding, is that they're going section level adaptive, not question level adaptive.
Me too.
Gotcha. Okay, Bob?
Yeah, they've said 2 subsections to each test. Within each subsection, each student will get a unique mix of questions, and that these difficulty level of section based aggregate score of the first subsection, each content area, critical, et cetera.
Gotcha. So it's section level adaptive. That's what we believe. And Neil, do you have a source that you can share?
I don't remember offhand. I got it off the Q&A on the announcement site. It's sort of buried deep in there, but Paul, maybe you know where it is.
Yeah,
Paul,
Compass's article said that. I'm pretty sure Compass's article said, yeah, Compass's article did say that it's section adaptive. So, Adam Ingersoll. I had a question though. So, as I understand it, there's going to be a calculator built in. And since, we've got this parallel with GRE already, I'm wondering if it's going to be the same and calculator as GRE.
I can tell you the GRE on screen calculator is a royal pain in the ass.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, I believe it's the same calculator that's used for the Praxis. So I'm thinking they might use it across the board, which would take out the calculator element.
Didn't they say that you can use your own calculator?
I did not hear that.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Oh, I thought they said that you can bring your own calculator or use the calculator on the screen.
I read something to that effect yesterday. Yes, that's what I saw. I don't recall the source.
And I thought it said it was Desmos that they were going to be using.
That I heard the same two things, that you can bring your own calculator, and the same thing with Desmos from the College Board site.
Right.
Okay, great. So you can bring your own calculator, and this is for the PSAT or the SAT, the new digital. And it's from the College Board site. Excellent.
Do you think that the modules are going to be like, there's going to be a verbal part for module 1 and then module 2 verbal, like depending on how you score in module 1, or and then a math 1 and then a math 2?
So in the GRE, you get, there's 2 verbals and 2 maths, and the difficulty of the second verbal or the second math is dependent on your performance of the first one, but they mix up those sections. It wasn't clear to me from the site, or actually rather, it looked to me like you would take all of the verbal straight through, and at some point, possibly unbeknownst to you, you would move from the first module to the second module. But I think you would know, because once you move to the second module, there's no way you can go back to the first module. But whether that all happens in a back-to-back section or in separate sections, that was not clear to me exactly what that setup's going to be.
Okay. I have a question. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but will it still be reading, and is it still going to be multiple choice, grammar, and punctuation? And also the proportions. Will it be half math, or it will be a third of each, like it was between 2005 and 2016?
I thought I read somewhere that it was going to be the reading and writing were going to be combined into one section.
Yes, I read the same thing.
Yeah.
I read that as well.
So basically the same. It's going to be a quarter reading, quarter writing and language, and half math.
That's what I think.
I think that's the
given
inference
that they're
to draw.
going to given that they're going to maintain the 1600 standard, and they're going to need to correlate those, like pre-change and post-change, so that a kid getting a 750 on the verbal before the change, it should be the same as a kid getting 750 on the verbal after the change. From a content and a proportionality standpoint, I would imagine they would try to match that pretty closely in order to have continuities in those scores, because Lord knows the admissions folks hate it when suddenly the meaning of a score changes, because that undercuts the whole relevance of the test itself.
So here's a little addition from Bob Schaefer. These are the tools that will be included: a way to flag questions in order to come back to them later, a countdown clock, which students can choose to show or hide, a built-in graphing calculator students can use on the entire math section, a reference sheet for each math question consisting of common formulas. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question regarding the, the consistency of results, pre and post conversion? That's the one thing I was looking for and frankly did not see. I'm just wondering, because there's been all the other discussion about trying to change the test to address, equity issues, all sorts of other things. Is it really a primary objective for the, the verbal or the math sections to track and longitudinally correlate pre and post conversion? I kind of thought that there was an essence of the change that was actually going to break from that to create a truly, quote unquote, truly new SAT. I'm just curious to what degree anybody on this call has heard that that is a mandate that it must be highly correlated, or if they're going to use this as an opportunity to redesign the test and yeah, it kind of might be a little bit correlated.
Are you asking if they will be able to use concordance between old tests and new tests?
I guess I'm asking that. Thank you for that. The question is more this: is that really even an objective as they redesign this, as they design this new version? I mean, are they really, are they really trying to have it so that there is correlation and tracking of the current test versus the one that will be released? Or are they saying no, because we're not going to do that. We're moving into the digital era, and we are going to make some changes to the exam so that issues of income and ethnicity and all the other inequity sorts of things that have been discussed about the exams, that those can at least in part be addressed, and they can use that even if they don't make substantial changes. They can use that as sort of a PR statement. I don't know. I heard, about a month ago, and I read several things where they're saying that the new version that will come out will attempt to do exactly that, because places like the UC and possibly the CSU and other large university systems going test blind because of concerns about testing in general. So I'm wondering if that's also a primary objective, more so than trying to make sure that there's a correlation pre and post conversion.
I think one of the important things here to keep in mind is this is ultimately a business decision, right? This is strictly, in my opinion, having been through the change in this industry in 2005, again in 2015, they have made changes when they are losing their number of testers, right? And we know that there was a drop of a little bit over 30% just between 2020 and 2021. And we know that they rely heavily on testing going on within the school, right? I think I read a stat, it's a little bit over 62% of students that test during the school on a school day. One of the big things, in my opinion, about this change is to make it more proctor friendly and to make it more administrator friendly in terms of costs, so that they're not losing that track revenue or hopefully gaining some more revenue around those lines. When they're looking at a change, yes, we are looking to see the scores equate, but anytime there's a dramatic change just in the way the content is delivered, the scores are not necessarily going to be, hey, you got this before on your grammar, you got this now, other than the fact that we know the bell curve does come into play, right? That's the whole reason why things are scaled, is to try and come back and equate that equity or equate that standardization amongst the scores. The other thing that did happen, and again, I don't know how many of you were around for 5 and 15, but the bell curve was extremely student friendly the first two administrations in order for the test to gain fans, right? They needed people shouting from the rooftops, hey, look at what I did on my SAT compared to what they did before. And then the next few administrations just completely tanked in order to come back and norm it for that year's worth of data that they do. So we know there are changes coming. They've already said that the reading is going to be shorter and it's one question per passage. When students can't use their pencil to annotate on a book, it takes longer to annotate on a screen. There are going to be some changes changes with regards to this. But because the bell curve is remaining standard, long-term, the same score will be the same score because it's all about how the student does amongst their peers. But I expect to be a big spike the first two administrations if their trends hold true.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with Rachel entirely. If I were SAT and I needed to grab some market share back from ACT, boy, the first thing I do is make this thing more accessible, more convenient, have scores come back right away, make it shorter. They're hitting this anxiety piece really hard. Like these are completely logical moves if you want to get some market share back. And now the ACT looks like the dinosaur. So yeah, they need to win back some eyeballs.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what happened the last two changes. So and I feel like that's the little known piece. You know, the public doesn't know that this is really like two giants fighting for market share. And, you know, as noble as they purport to be, it's still, there's a business behind this. And it's becoming a bigger business now that it's sort of integrated with, or more integrated with workforce development. So.
But I'm thinking that we're going to see a little bit of a migration to ACT like we have in past tests when there's been changes for a while, because it's established and everyone knows what to expect.
There's another business benefit, by the way, which is that as soon as you go adaptive, your question item creation gets a lot more efficient and your exam security likely gets better. To Paul's point, like early smart money is going to move ACT because it's a known quantity and there's practice items out there and it's predictable. I have to say, from our cognitive models, the current benefit to the SAT for just as capable cognitive but slower students, I think is going to be even more exacerbated on this test. I think there actually might be, and the other thing I've seen is that like some things are going to drop out of the model, like the short-term memory plays on those longer passages, right? Working memory, that's going to drop out a little bit in terms of importance. I've always thought stamina was a big issue, but we just recently went through our models and stamina actually is not a huge issue. So that's not going to be a benefit on the new one. But time per question is a huge distinguisher right now. And that may be even more exacerbated on the new one.
Hey everybody, I'm Joanna Dean with Dean Academy. I just wanted to let you know that I have a private student that I've been working with out of Indiana, and her school has been selected to take this new computer test. And I have got the email from the school. She is taking the March 2nd on computer, not in 23, next in the next few weeks. So we're going to know a lot more. I have said I will pay you to debrief her on what that test is like. I'm going to have to drop off because I've got a student at 11:30, but I would love to do this again. And I'd love to share with you what I hear back from this student. And that is out of Carmel High School in Indiana.
Well, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Joanna. I'll reach out to you separately to see if we can schedule a follow-up.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd love to share everything because I don't know about you guys, but this was a gut punch. I have made the SAT my life for the last several years. And what scared me was this adaptive. I'm like, what does that translate into? And how does that correlate to their scores? And how is that standardized? And that just made me really nervous. So yes, I will share with you. Kevin, reach out to me and I'd love to go back on and just share whatever I can with all of you. But for now, I've got to drop out.
Okay,
Hey, Joanna, before you drop real quick, hey, James Dolan, Tutor Dr. Indy. Carmel's actually in my backyard here, and I was aware of that. I'd love to maybe compare notes and see how we might be able to help attack that together.
Yes, I saw that it said TD Indy. So yes, I would love to, James, please.
Right.
And you can reach me at joanna@deanacademy.net.
Got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Have a great
Hi,
meeting.
Joanna. Thank you.
Good to see you on. I was just about to send you a ping on this very topic, James. So thank you for appearing.
I got a lot of friends here. I see Neil is an expert on this call. That's fantastic.
It's worth noting from a business standpoint that every time there has been a significant change in the test, there is a bump in the advising and the tutoring business, especially if you play it right and get out ahead of it. I remember back in 92, 93, when they first put the dual passage on there. Then I remember when we went through recentering. Then I remember when we like combined the standalone verbal test with the 2400 scale, when analogies dropped off the test. Like I have, and when I ran the GRE products, same thing. I was there for the conversion from paper and pencil to question level adaptive to section level adaptive. I remember being terrified when these things come up. And then all of a sudden, people start looking to you as an expert for advice, and you get out ahead of it. And this does not. We can talk about the overall implications of the test and what this means at large, but from a local business standpoint, there is an opportunity here to ride this and benefit from this. In fact,
Hey, I got a
Kevin,
quick
I don't
question,
wanna-
Rob, all these changes to SAT, does that change Fair Test's position at all? Is he
He
still
might
there?
have left. I don't see him.
Oh, no.
Test was
It just has his
interviewed on
camera
a
off,
couple of.
but he's still here.
So Bob, he sent me Fair Test's response, and I'll share that as well. So what I'm sharing is I'll share this recording, I'll share the PowerPoint, and I'll share Fair Test's response.
Hey, Kevin, just
yeah.
real quick, I don't want to railroad your agenda here, but I'm curious what thoughts are on a shortened test and how that affects test preparation. Are we going to see the types of questions limited? Are we going to see fewer questions from each type? How we think that might be impacted?
I
I'm
think the
happy to take that
expectation is
one.
fewer questions, shorter sections, integrated reading and writing questions, like into shorter sections, more time per question. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, and others can pipe in. So.
They are definitely seeing more time per question, but I don't think we're going to see a dramatic shift in the categories that the questions are coming from. The goal is to just make them more targeted, right? So they're saying, hey, students are going to spend less time working on things that they already know very well, and we're going to be able to escalate them. If we are really looking at a GRE perspective on this, though, that's doing a couple of things, right? While the questions may be more randomized within that first section, it doesn't mean that students don't need to be prepared for different types of questions. So the time spent within preparation, I would not expect in any way, shape, or form to see a dramatic change. To Neil's point, I expect that we're going to see an increase in this because there's a few things that come into play when you're talking adaptive. One, when the students are seeing questions that are easier than what they would expect to be, there's a certain level of anxiety that comes in association with that. Oh my gosh, what mistakes did I make? What am I going to have to do now? It's going to derail any potential momentum that they had and make them second guess what they're seeing. If they are doing well, they're working at a higher level of standard or an increased brain capacity as they're moving through things, which adds another level of intensity to the exam as you're moving through it. And it also means that we have to make sure that easier concepts have to be mastered before they're moving on to the more complex ones. So it means that, hey, while maybe your integers with negative exponents wasn't solid before, we know we have to get it solid in order for you to be able to see XYZ type of question in the future, or something that's more closely related to your chronological perspective. So I do not in any way, shape, or form expect to see a dramatic shift in the content that we need to help students be prepared for, almost the other way around.
Yeah, I
It's
think what-
that's a great point. On a pencil and paper test, when all questions are equal in terms of value, you can play to your strengths, do the ones you like, do the ones you're good at. And you can let some of those, negative exponent, fractional exponent things go by the wayside if you don't need those points. On an adaptive test, you actually have to be prepared for anything that you might see, because the value of those points are different, and you have to be ready for the harder questions as well. From a prep standpoint, one of the things, the shifts that we saw in GRE when it went from paper and pencil to adaptive, was you now have to cover all topics. You can't just play to a kid's strength. And that actually did change our strategy in terms of content and course design and working with kids.
I have a question. Are all the questions going to be worth the same number of points, whether they're hard or easy?
Well, I mean, we haven't seen the model, but the way it works on the GRE is the difficulty level of the second section is dependent solely on the raw number of questions you got right on the first section. But when they take your overall raw score and convert it to a scaled score, in order to get the highest possible scaled score, you have to have seen and gotten correct the hardest possible questions. And the only way to do that is to get as many questions as possible on the first section correct. So the scaled score does take into account the difficulty level of the questions that you've seen and answered correctly, but the shift from section 1 to section 2 is usually just raw score. At least that's the way it works on the GRE.
So we're saying that they're not all worth the same amount. Is that what you're saying, Neil?
I would say
Ultimately, no.
that the first section questions are worth the same amount as the first section questions, right? So a reading within the first section is the same as a reading within the first section. But then if you look GRE, you can go basically 3 different tiers approximately within that second verbal section: high tier, middle tier, low tier. Low tier questions in the second tier all have the same point value as low tier questions in that section, but a low tier question does not have the same impact on the score as a high tier question, but high tier questions within the high tier all have the same score equivalency within that section.
Well, one thing I was just gonna say, for the student, I mean, I think probably we've all seen students who are a little careless, who are very strong, say, math skills, but are a little careless on some computation. It seems like they're going to get hurt by making a careless error early and not be able to make up for it by, crushing the ostensibly hard questions toward the end, which seems like a shift in focus for some students in their prep.
That was actually a question I'd received just before, back in December, when they were talking about these tests going online. Very, very intelligent guy. And he asked if I knew, and I certainly didn't, but let me throw the question here. I think it piggybacks onto what Edward was just saying. If you have a very smart, well-prepared student, but for some reason they're either not feeling well or anxious or something, and let's say they kind of blow the first 3 or 4 questions, are they doomed at that point, such that if they shake off whatever is bugging them, that now they're sort of relegated into a lower score for at least the rest of that particular section, and certainly beneath their level of capability? Is that a possibility given adaptive nature?
I would think they'd have the rest of the section to rebound, but I kind of want to go ahead, Kevin, because I want to kind of piggyback what.
Yeah. So if it's like the GRE or any ETS based test, that could sabotage their ability to really score well. But Neil, I will ask you if you think that.
I mean, to some extent, that's true now on the paper and pencil test, right? Like the quote unquote careless errors, or the kid with weaker attention or weaker or too fast processing speed who makes those errors is hurt now. That is on a question level adaptive, those early errors magnify almost exponentially and can be impossible to recover from. you have more ability to recover from that on a section level. But with a fewer number of questions per section, you know, a couple of those could tilt you the wrong way and prevent you from seeing the harder questions on the second section, which will put a ceiling on your score. So yeah, that problem could well be magnified on this test.
So my thought is, I'm thinking that three different students could get three different scores getting the same number correct. If one gets fewer wrong on the first, so they're on the lower track, and then they get more wrong, right on the lower track second. And then one middle line student's like pretty even across the board. And someone who does well on the first gets so many more wrong on the second, that you could have three different students get the same number correct and incorrect, three different scores.
Right.
And
Yep.
it's adaptive.
Yeah. So imagine you get the first section, you get 15 right, 5 wrong. You get a harder second section. Now you get 5 right, 15 wrong. Right. And both, you've gotten 20 questions right across the board. Student 2 comes in, is a weaker student, 5 right, 15 wrong on the first one. So easier second section, 15 right, 5 wrong on the second one. Also got 20 questions wrong. The first student scores higher because they saw the harder questions and, let's hope, got them right.
Right.
Is this process supposed to be better?
It depends
SAT
on
is,
probably what market share for College Board.
It's
I mean,
shorter.
Wait.
For
I didn't,
who?
everybody answered at once.
College Board is toting it as better because students get to spend more targeted time in their ideal area.
That's insane. If you're telling me that 3 kids who get a 15 out of 30 are going to get 3 different scores, what about the highly bright students who tank the beginning questions because they took intro to algebra and geometry as 7th and 8th graders? They're going to be penalized for being smart. Talk about a reversed prejudice.
It's got to be
Yeah,
reviewed.
so it's definitely a quandary, I think, for a lot of.
That's why we have tutors.
But at
Exactly.
the same time, I mean, working in New York City with the SHSAT, it's always been the case that you could get fewer questions right and get a higher score depending on the distribution of where you get your questions right and wrong.
Yeah, good point. Edward.
And I was also thinking like the adaptive thing is just gonna, that's why you could get a 1600 score within 2 hours instead of 3, because it's going to be more efficient since it is adaptive. That's one thing that I was thinking. And then another thing I was thinking, just from a College Board standpoint,
I have to make sure that you're careful about how you're claiming that sufficiency though, Paul, right? Because again, please keep in mind that it doesn't mean that students necessarily get to see the concepts that they're best at or that are most relevant to them. It's claiming to be more efficient, but from a student perspective, I very much disagree that that's the case. So when you're talking with your students and families, please just make sure that you're careful about how you preface that from a exposure content.
Why you got to cover all concepts across the board more now than before.
yeah, I get that. But in that case, I think that the test could cover, if it's covering a wider swath of questions than it was before, then it, like in practice, it sounds to me like it's more efficient. Instead of, beating around with a kid who's doing well, beating around with a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions, just giving them all hard questions. I mean,
the catch though, Paul, is if they increase the amount of content they cover, they're going to have they won't have a standardized test anymore. So, they can only expand that so much and expect to get any kind of normalized result. I mean, again, I think there are experts here like Neil and Kevin that probably have a more clout to what they would answer to that. But like, honestly, the GRE, I mean, sure, it's adaptive, but only kind of barely. And I mean, I don't know, I don't tutor that as much as I tutor a lot of the other tests, but for many of my students, all it is really a head game, because if they get into that second section and the first question seems easy to them, it freaks them out. It doesn't help. It doesn't make them feel better. They're like, oh my gosh, this question isn't hard for me. I must have done something wrong. And now they're kind of panicked for the whole second section. But it isn't especially adaptive either. So it'll be interesting to see. I have two questions. One is, do we have a sense of whether or not, and I guess we will after this March, whether they're ready to do this? Because they try to bring the APs online and it was a disaster. Well, I'll leave it there and see if anybody has any sense of, do we think they can actually pull this off?
Isn't the change going to be in like 23 or something like that? So
Yeah.
I would
Not
assume
for
that
the
that
international.
indicates they're not ready now.
Well, the woman that just spoke said she's got a student who's doing the test this March as sort of as a pilot project. I'm just wondering if anybody has any insider knowledge as to whether or not they think they like, the situation with the APs the first year of the pandemic was students went to take it online. If their computer crashed, they were done, and now they had to retake several months later. So
That was wasn't that at home though?
it was at home, but we're living in 2022. You would think they would figure out a save function. That was essentially the problem. You lost your information if you got logged out. So if your internet crashed, game over. I could just imagine like they're feeling like this is better because proctors can now proctor it on location. But now there's all the thing of like, well, this student was taking it on her own test. That student was taking it on the school device. It just feels like this is a can of worms. Honestly, the College Board, I'm in the Bay Area, they went a year, even really a little bit more, was more like a year and a half of the pandemic where they could not figure out how to proctor a test in the Bay Area. Just cancellations, couldn't figure out that, yeah, the school's not open. You're probably not going to be hosting a thing there. Cancellations 24 hours before the test, people showing up and not being notified that the test was canceled. So, I'm not instilled with a whole lot of confidence that they're going to be able to pull off this next level adaptive, high tech kind of test. And I'm just curious. Whatever it is, we'll tutor and we'll support kids, but I'm just curious if anybody has any insight to that.
If it's, if they have access to the architecture for the GRE, then it's not too much of a leap to actually produce this and implement it on time. And in fact, I thought they were planning to introduce it a year ago, but held up because of student access issues. So I'm leaning to, yes, they will be able to deliver it. I don't know how good it will be, but I'm leaning to, yeah, I believe they'll be able to deliver it along the timeline that they shared with us.
Are saying if the student does lose internet or does lose power, that their work will be saved and they will jump back into where they were when they do regain that.
Yes.
We do have to take into account things like, potentially fighting for outlets if students are not charging their devices. So there is that thing that comes into play. We're not told yet about breaks or when they are, but you do have to keep in mind that if a student does get bounced from their test, that they're going to have to deal with distractions of other students in that space being on a break at a different time than they are. And while it's saying that, yes, this is accessible in terms of loaner devices or things of that nature, I think that you also need to take it with a grain of salt in terms of how likely students are that would need to borrow a device on site to take this test if they do not have their own or they do not have a school issued, that's going to be one more hurdle or deterrent from getting them to participate because of the stigma attached with it.
So I want to, I need to sort of funnel us into the remainder of the presentation because we are up against a 60-minute window here. If you do have questions on the academics or just questions in general, please put them in the chat and we have a meeting scheduled with College Board next week. And so I can try and ask questions that we have here that are open questions. And also Neil is if you don't know, Neil Seltzer is on our advisory board and he's the director of academics. And if you want to schedule a consultation with him, you can do that as well, or with anyone on our advisory board. Just go to our board page at tpep.com and schedule a time to talk. So here's what the College Board is saying, and this is important from the perspective of business development and like having a one sheet handy. And I mean, I'm a-religious when it comes to these stats. So according to the College Board, every single student that took the test in 2020 basically improved their college application profile by virtue of their test score. So I'm not sure if maybe 2 million took it and 1.7 million. I could be wrong on my stats. So almost every student improved their candidate profile. That's going to be a talking point. They're going to hammer that over and over again, right? When they surveyed students, and they don't provide the number of students surveyed, 83% of the students said they wanted the option to submit test scores to colleges. And so that's another big talking point. You know, students want to take the test. They want the opportunity to show, you know, that they want the opportunity to improve their candidate profile, which the SAT will help them do. There are more than 25,000 high schools in the US, and therefore establishing a level playing field among college applicants based on their high school curriculum is next to impossible. So this is, again, the messaging. And 55% of students by 2021, 55% of students have A averages. So this is one of the only objective measurements of student academic performance, and that I think will be hit hard. The other thing that they put out there was when they talked about the 1.7 million students that improved their candidacy, they also threw out first time in family college applicants and Black and Latinx, you know, so they're sort of parsing out the message that the SAT is really for everyone, and everyone benefits in terms of their college application. And I think they'll also continue to hammer the fact that the SAT, PSAT, SAT opens doors to merit-based aid, and that's true. I mean, it absolutely does. There's $4 billion, I think, at my last look, tied to those scores, even now, even in the age of test optional. So I expect those things will be put out there. Now, I tell you this because whatever your position, and if you are sort of ramping up for being able to adapt to this and thrive on the changes to the business environment, which will absolutely come, you need to sort of have this, your team needs to sort of understand that this is the broad picture that SAT is painting. And some of it, I mean, there are statistics behind it, and some of it, you know, you should look at all of it with a critical eye. But if these things are true, they are compelling and they should be discussed with parents. So I'm going to stop there and just see if there's any quick questions on that.
I was just going to say that in the article that came out around this, you know, Yale basically chimed into the same kind of thing and said, you know, there are a couple others, but Yale's the one that comes to mind, that, hey, everybody that applies to us has an A average. This is a distinguishing factor. And, you know, it's a compelling argument, right? Like, you know, no, you don't have to have a test score, and no, you don't have to participate in a leadership activity, but both of those things contribute to identifying you. So that was helpful. One question that, again, you can answer later. Do we know, will they be allowed to use scratch paper as you can on the GRE, or does it sound like everything is going to be on screen?
That's a great question. I think we all still are wondering that. If it's like the GRE, you can use scratch paper, right, Neil? They
issue what is it, 3 or 6 sheets of scratch paper that you must return in full at the end of the exam, as opposed to the GMAT, where, you know, you've got these little whiteboards. I don't think they'll go the whiteboard route. I'm very curious to see what the scratch paper rules are, and how consistently they get enforced, et cetera.
It's worth mentioning that I don't know how many people have had this experience, but people taking the GRE at home this last, you know, year or so, were allowed to have a whiteboard or basically a piece of paper in a slick sheet and be able to prove at any time that you were erasing your scratch paper, AKA you're not stealing questions. But oh my gosh, the ridiculous factor that added was just insane.
Yeah, so it will be really interesting to see how this unfolds. So someone alluded to this earlier, but so let's see, I've overseen or been involved in commercial test prep through multiple test changes, from the grad test to the SAT test. I think I'm old enough to have seen the last 3 SAT test changes. In the last one in 2005, Kaplan's business just went through the roof. Okay, so there's a normal sort of trajectory that, as Neil I think alluded to earlier, where the number of test takers immediately before the change and at some point after the change goes up, but more so before the change, because you have fear and anxiety out there and people want to take a known sort of quantity, and there's no reason not to. I mean, if you've had through the maths that you need for the SAT, there's no reason to not take the current version of the test and the new version of the test and see how you score, at least not so far. We haven't heard that you wouldn't be able to submit either test. Am I right on that one, Neil?
Sorry, what was the question?
So you could take the current test and you could take the computer adaptive test if you're a student, and you could still choose which test to submit to your schools.
I think so. I don't remember language specifically to that effect, but I also don't remember them saying not, and I can't imagine how they would say, no, you can't. I mean, they're going to ask for scores, you're going to submit them. To some extent, that's up to the schools, not up to the College Board. But you know, there's no way they can say, no, you can't submit this score. That wouldn't make any sense.
So I'll check on that. I'll make sure my language is correct. But the reality is that you should expect to see an increase in demand, and you should prepare for it. So, you know, you should be planning for it really now, because I think there'll be, you know, a lot of media coverage on this for at least a little while longer, and that distills down to the families in your community. So I think it's important to sort of embrace it and adapt, and whatever way you choose to adapt, you should just be prepared to adapt, and you should prepare your infrastructure to adapt. So if that means there's going to be you believe me, and there's going to be at least a 10 to 20% increase in overall student demand, which translates into an increase in demand at the local tutoring level, you should make sure your team is well trained and, you know, equipped to help students, and maybe add people if you think that you don't have enough tutoring availability to cover this increase in demand. So, and that's
Kevin,
great.
I think it's also important that we stress that this can accelerate timelines for students that would be typically testing directly after this test, where those that would typically be waiting for June of their senior year or June of their spring of their junior year in 2024 are going to be escalating that. And that could even relate to, you know, so it's just important that you're ready for the escalation that comes with it, and not just the increase. But fall is going to be busier than a traditional fall, in terms of the grade levels that you're going to be working with right before this.
Right.
It's also forums like this where we can all come compare notes and be experts, so that when we go back out and start getting on the phones and talking to our parents and being active in our community, that we come across as the people with the answers that you can trust. I mean, that's part of why I love what's happening right here.
I recall back when the change happened in 2015 with the SAT. We were at a pretty large event. There's 200 universities and such were there. Collectively, my team probably spoke with 15 or 20. And at that time, the vast majority of the people said they would prefer to see an ACT because it was a proven commodity, and they weren't quite sure what the new change to the SAT would be or render. And so we were shocked, especially in California, being very SAT focused here. So I don't know if a similar thing will happen. So really just two questions. One, has ACT issued any statement about their digitization before the SAT event, or sort of in counter after? I assume that they're not countering, because otherwise they'd be giving credibility to it. But I'm curious if ACT has an update. And then secondly, have you also experienced that in the past where people moved over to the ACT, at least temporarily, because they were concerned about changes in the SAT?
Yes. And in those the third and fourth bullet points, prepare for an increase in PSAT prep interest and prepare for an increase in ACT interest, or escalation, if we want to use that same word that Rachel shared. I've seen it every time there's been an SAT test change. I've seen 3, and yeah, there's a migration of, or there's an increase, there's an escalation of interest in the ACT. Yes.
I would just say one thing for everybody to keep in mind, if you haven't lived through this before, is there's sort of that panic around what the College Board's doing. And so people want to migrate instantly to the ACT. And I would just say for your students, share this with your teams. The ACT is still really tough on that certain set of students that process well, but slowly. And, I know I was sort of like, with 4 tests with the SATs, 2016 release, like, okay, don't panic, let's look, because if you already look okay on this and you are going to totally suffer on the ACT, this is enough for you to go down this path. Whereas some of the larger organizations were just like, nope, all ACT. And, the poor kids that kind of got caught in not being able to keep pace in a way that showed off their skills on the ACT really kind of got hammered in that. So I would just say, a savvy piece of this is don't just assume every kid's going to do the ACT while the change is happening. Spend some time making sure that kid's not going to suffer for it.
I can't reinforce that enough. Like, kids who think they're being smart by going ACT, some of them are being smart, but for some of them, that is actually bad advice. But that is a knowable, measurable thing. And I think that the gap between SAT and ACT in terms of time per question and the impact on a subset of students is going to be even greater than it is today.
Does anyone have a prediction for when ACT will only be available online?
Well, they've been online electronic only internationally for a while now.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, like, how long will it take them to make the same change?
But it's a linear pencil and paper style format internationally. Right? Like, they haven't gone CAT.
All right.
So
I
it's
had
like
local
paper and pencil test.
high schools take their ACT online.
Yeah, I'm just curious if anyone, had a prediction as to when the ACT will no longer be available pencil paper.
I'll just say, if they're savvy, they'll keep it on pencil and paper, and they'll keep eating at College Board's market share, because if kids want to take it on paper, they can.
That's who said that? That's
Megan. That was me, Megan, Kevin.
Yeah. So yes, that's, I think, what we should, what ACT will do, or I don't know, but I know that the computer-based test has been available since 2021, right, Rose? And they've been doing it at some high schools in your area. So they have computer-based testing. They don't have computer adaptive testing.
Yeah, it's not adaptive.
So listen,
we all know that ACT missed the boat already in terms of twice announcing the launch of the section only retakes on a computer-based format and failing to deliver on that, right? I think that would have been the #1 game changer that they would have gone to if they would have been ready in any way, shape, or form to deliver on a broad scale electronically. And I completely agree with Megan that we're going to see more of the, here's why we didn't now, to come back and combat that.
okay, folks. So I hate to wrap this up, but we're running into another meeting that we have that the advisory.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
My pleasure. So I'll share the deck, which has these links to the source material that I used. If you had questions, you put them in the chat, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll direct those to our College Board contact next week. Yeah, and if you need me, I'm teach@testprepprofessionals.com. And I want to thank you all for sharing coffee and conversation. We'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.
Have a great day.
Kevin. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kevin.
You guys, take care.